Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my retrospective boxing series. So today we're going to be looking at the career of one of the more unusual fighters in boxing. During the course of this series I've received quite a few requests to review careers of fighters who are somewhat obscure. Fighters who may not have been very well known or particularly well accomplished, but for whatever reason had a career that's interesting to talk about. And one fighter that I've been consistently asked to talk about over the years is Emanuel Augustus. So for those of you who don't know, Emanuel Augustus was a journeyman fighter from the early 90s who competed until 2011. Those of you who have been following my channel will know that I'm generally quite clued up on the overall 90s and 2000s boxing scene. You ask me about pretty much any fighter from that era, and I'll probably have a good idea who they are, who they fought, what their record was like, and generally how good they were. And on occasion I could probably even give you a detailed career review right off the top of my head. However, Emanuel Augustus is one fighter from that era who surprisingly up until very recently I barely knew anything about. I had never watched a single fight of his, never looked deeply at his record or did any research on him. The reason for this is that back when I was active on the old boxing forums, long before I made this channel, I came across Emanuel Augustus's name a few times, and I took one look at his record, and with me being quite ignorant back then, I saw that he had almost as many losses as wins, and just assumed that he wasn't any good, so I never really thought much about him again. However, with me really getting into my retrospective series, one of the things that I've learned is that there are quite a few fighters in boxing who are significantly better than their record suggests. And for me, after watching and studying Emanuel Augustus, looking at as many fights of his as I could find, I believe he is definitely one of those fighters. Looking at this guy in the ring, and seeing some of the guys he lost to, it's sometimes hard to imagine how that happened. Because this guy clearly had a lot of talent, as well as a lot of natural athletic ability. What Augustus became famous for is that he was the kind of fighter who would be brought in at short notice if a promoter had a fighter that needed a fight, and he was one of these guys who would always stay in shape, and he would always come to fight. And due to his record not being that impressive on paper, what often happened was some of the prospects and fringe contenders he would fight would underestimate him, and this would lead to him giving them a really hard fight, and on the odd occasion even winning. So while he was never a legit contender or anything like that, he always at very least was a difficult trial horse for any prospect. So Emanuel Augustus turned professional in 1994 and spent the early part of his career fighting on low-level cards across America. The vast majority of his early fights actually went the distance. And the win-to-loss ratio was all over the place. He won some, he lost some, he drew some, and sadly there isn't really a lot of footage of that whole portion of his career to go on to verify how those fights actually went, which is a shame. One of the more significant losses he had in the early part of his career was a 7th round knockout loss to a very young Jesus Chavez, who was 6-1 at the time. Again, I haven't been able to find any footage of that fight. He also had a disqualification loss to the undefeated British prospect Stephen Smith in a fight that took place in Germany. Supposedly he was DQ'd for a low blow, but I haven't seen it. The first genuine contender he faced was the undefeated 22-0 Ivan Robinson, losing by a one-sided decision. After a string of both wins and losses against random low-level prospects and local club fighters, most of which to their credit actually had winning records, he travelled over to Denmark for another major step-up fight, taking on the seasoned contender Søren Søndergaard in an 8-round contest. Søndergaard was far past his prime and on the verge of retirement, but you would have expected him to deal with a guy like Augustus with relative ease. As it happens, that wasn't the case, and the fight was very close and competitive, with both men fighting to a draw, with Augustus being only the second man to put a blemish on Søndergaard's record. Going into that fight, Augustus already had 12 losses and 3 draws, so you could see why Søndergaard underestimated him. Later that very same month, he travelled over to the UK to take on the popular switch hitter John Thaxton. You guys might remember John Thaxton. He was a guy who used to train with the Ingles. He was kind of a English level contender. He actually gave Ricky Hatton a pretty tough fight back in the day and almost stopped him. Now, my opinion on that fight may be in the minority, but I personally thought Thaxton got robbed. He was winning the fight handily, outworking, outlanding and outboxing Augustus, winning pretty much every round easily, before getting hurt once in round 7 by a flurry of punches, and being stopped by the referee. Despite the fact Thaxton never went down, wasn't cut, was still moving and riding the storm, the ref stopped the fight prematurely. It's worth pointing out that the referee for that fight was Dave Paris, who was notorious for stopping fights prematurely, just a truly dreadful referee. I'm about 80% certain that if he didn't stop the fight, Thaxton would have made it to the end of the round, recovered, and won the fight pretty easily. So in my opinion, Augustus got a gift there. The following year, after an easy win against the undefeated Jamar Carter, he travelled back over to Denmark to face the 10-0 prospect Alan Vester. After a hard-fought 11 rounds, Augustus was knocked out in the closing seconds of the 12th round, with him seemingly collapsing from sheer exhaustion after taking a flurry of punches. There's actually a bit of debate about that knockout online, since certain people have accused Augustus of taking a dive. Me personally, I'm not so sure about that. I wouldn't rule it out, but Augustus was known to have stamina issues due to taking fights on short notice and not always being prepared to go 12 rounds. So I think the knockout could have been legit, but that's just my opinion. After losing to Vester, he returned to America and had a surprising 8th round KO against the undefeated contender Terrell Finger. After that fight though, he seemed to go off the rails a bit, losing back-to-back fights usually by one-sided decision, losing to the likes of Antonio Diaz, Terry Reed, and the veteran John Molina, before getting a fight against the undefeated Floyd Mayweather, which is probably the fight he's most famous for to this day, and despite his record prior, it was actually a pretty interesting fight while it lasted. Augustus gave Floyd a lot of problems, landed a lot of punches, made him miss, and even styled on him at times. However, as the fight went on, as he often did, Augustus started to gas, and basically just stood right in front of Floyd, taking flurries of punches, and was stopped on his feet in round 9, taking too many unanswered blows. The following year, after a couple of easy low-level wins, he got a fight against Irish Mickey Ward, and it was a tremendous fight. Ward got off to a great start, backing Augustus up to the ropes and landed some hard body shots, and it seemed like he was going to break him down and stop him. However, as the fight went on, Ward began to slow down a bit, and Augustus landed some brutal counterpunches, stopping Ward in his tracks, and it looked like he was going to drop him at one point. He won some of the mid-rounds big, and a lot of people watching it live thought he was going to completely take over the fight. However, Ward made a big comeback in round 9, dropping Augustus with a body punch and finishing the fight strongly, winning by a clear unanimous decision. Despite losing the fight, it earned Augustus a lot of fans. Just a couple of months later, he lost again by unanimous decision to the undefeated Leonard Dorin in a pretty one-sided fight. The following year, he had a highly disputed draw against fringe contender Levander Johnson, before going on another losing streak, including a one-sided 8-round decision loss to the undefeated David Diaz. He had another highly controversial draw to the undefeated prospect Alvaro Aguilar, before scoring a surprising decision win over the 23-1 contender Alex Trujillo. In his next fight, he was disqualified for the second time in his career, this time against Journeyman Thomas Barentes. I haven't been able to find footage of that fight, but I have heard that it was highly controversial. Speaking of being highly controversial, his next fight was one of the most controversial and debated fights of his entire career, where he travelled over to Michigan to take on the popular local contender Corey Burton. Officially, Burton won by a controversial split decision, which many people, including myself, felt Augustus should have won. However, that doesn't tell the full story, and I wouldn't go as far as to call it a flat-out robbery. Let me explain. So one of the major talking points about that fight was the referee. The ESPN commentators Joe Tessitore and Teddy Atlas were, in my opinion, very unprofessional that night, and convinced the audience that it was worse than it actually was. First of all, the referee had a really hard situation to deal with that night. Augustus was constantly showboating, talking to the crowd, and turning his back to the opponent, which by the way is illegal. The ref took a point away late in the fight as Augustus spun himself out of a clinch, once again turning his back to the opponent, and the commentators went mental over it, screaming and shouting at the ref while he was trying to do his job. The ref gave Augustus ample warnings for turning his back, and rather than follow instructions, he kept arguing with the ref, clowning around, talking to the crowd and the ringside officials, and generally just being a pain in the ass. This in collaboration with the fact that the fight was generally quite messy and difficult to score, with neither guy really landing a whole lot of punches. Augustus was constantly confusing the officials, distracting them, and it kind of overshadowed the good work that he did in the fight, and rather than capitalise on the opportunities he had, he decided to just stop fighting and keep talking to the crowd and the referee. And if truth be told, he kind of embarrassed himself, in my opinion, threw the fight away when it should have been an easy victory. So I have no argument with the point deduction, but the decision itself I personally didn't agree with. I thought Augustus won the close fight, but he kind of shot himself in the foot with the way he performed, is all I'm saying. After losing to Burton, he got a fight against the journeyman Karu, stopping him in the 8th round after a dominant performance, before getting a shot at the veteran former champion Marcus Oliveira. Oliveira was completely shot at that stage of his career, but he was still a decent name to have on the resume. Augustus dominated the fight, stopping him in the 8th round. He then travelled over to Canada and had a surprising 12-round decision loss to an 11-0 Cameroonian club fighter named Herman Nguju. Another strange result there. Talk about fighting to the level of your opposition. The following year he had another 12-round decision loss to a journeyman called Arturo Mura, a journeyman with a decent record if truth be told, as well as a rematch with Courtney Burton, this time winning by an 8th round KO, putting the controversy of the first fight behind him. He then had a one-sided 10-round decision loss to Kyrgyzstani contender Almazbek Ramkalov. I'm sorry if I completely butchered that guy's name, losing every single round. Later that year he travelled over to Russia to take on the fringe contender Sergei Sirotkin, once again getting dominated and losing pretty much every round, losing by a wide unanimous decision. It seemed at that point that Augustus was on the decline, since he was starting to lose even more often than before, and in more one-sided fashion than before, and it was very clear that he appeared to be slowing down a bit. After losing to Sirotkin, he dropped down a level and had a few easy wins against low-level journeymen, before getting a shot at the tough Puerto Rican club fighter Francisco Figueroa. In what was a very close and competitive fight, Augustus lost by a controversial split decision over 10 rounds. After losing to Figueroa, he took a bit of a break from boxing, before making a comeback the following year taking on the undefeated Nigerian prospect Wale Omatoso. Augustus looked a shadow of his former self, being dominated and stopped in the 9th round. He then had another break from boxing before coming back the following year again, in mid-2010, taking on the undefeated Russian prospect, the tough, dangerous punching Ruslan Provodnikov. Once again, Augustus was completely dominated, getting beaten up in every round, knocked down multiple times and stopped brutally in round 9, with many people calling for his retirement afterwards because it was a very, very one-sided loss. He had 2 more fights in his career, losing unanimous decisions to 2 undefeated prospects, Charles Hatley and Vernon Paris, before retiring finally in 2011. So yeah, that pretty much sums up the career of Emanuel Augustus, and for sure it's a pretty interesting one. I think Augustus stands as a prime example of how you don't necessarily need to be the best, or even have a winning record to have a fan base, since during the later part of his career, he did have a bit of a cult following. He was always a decent undercard attraction and a stern test for any young prospect or contender. The question is, how good could he have been if he'd had the right kind of promotional support and the right management that your average top-level prospect had? Who knows, maybe he even could have been world champion, you never know. It's certainly a possibility, stranger things have happened. As it happens though, he never had those things, and all through his pro career he was relegated to the role of high-level journeyman, but one that was quite popular for a while, as well as very unique and enigmatic. Thanks for watching guys, I really enjoyed looking into the career of Emanuel Augustus. Sorry that this was kind of a short one, but I honestly don't think there's much else to say about Augustus, because he really didn't have any proper career-defining wins in my opinion, and I honestly have no idea how good he was, because I don't think we ever really saw him at his best, or have any idea of his full potential. Whatever the case may be, thanks for watching guys, stay tuned for more retrospective career reviews, and yeah, God bless.